We are back to begin part 2, the final and last part of our protein chapter. We ended part 1 by talking about what the body does with the amino acids that it absorbs. And we can remember that when the body absorbs the amino acids, it has one of two paths to take. It will either, and to a smaller degree, the body will metabolize it for energy, but more commonly, those amino acids travel to the liver, and the liver forms these amino acid pools. The amino acid pools are collections of amino acids that circulate in the blood. That way, when a muscle cell or any cell needs protein, it can just grab right into the bloodstream and take what it needs. We talked about the fact that there needs to be however many proteins are taken out of the blood, whether they're old and broken down to be gotten rid of by the body, or whether they're being used by a muscle cell. For whatever protein we take out of the blood, we've got to put in new amino acids to replace it. And that process is called protein turnover. Good. Look at that. We just went right into the video. There was no pleasantries because we are, as they say, AB. All business, folks. I mean, not too much all business because then you have no fun, but sometimes you got to get down to business. Okay, so one more thing to talk about before we then go into proteins and exercise, and that is nitrogen or protein balance. You'll see it either way. You'll see it nitrogen balance, or you'll see it called protein balance, but it means the same thing because proteins contain nitrogen, so it means the same thing. All right. My pen is not working. Let me just do one quick thing here to see if I can get this pen to work. Always a problem when something happens, isn't it? Let me just plug that in for 1 second. And as that's being plugged in, I just charged it, but it doesn't seem to want to work. As that's charging, let me just talk about this without being able to write for a second. If we look in the middle of this bottom picture, we can see equilibrium. That's where you want to be. When you're in protein balance equilibrium, that means that your protein intake, which is to say the protein you bring in through food and the protein your body makes for you, your protein intake matches your protein excretion. Okay? So if we think about an athlete who's training, after a heavy training day, they're probably going to have more protein excretion. All right? Because they have more protein that they're getting rid of. So they need to therefore bring in more protein to balance it out. That would be at protein balance. However, there's going to be days, moments in time when you're not in protein balance. It will be very difficult to be 100% protein balance all the time. So an athlete in training might find themselves in a need to be in a positive protein balance. You can see I've circled it. Protein, athlete training, or pregnant women, or children who are growing, they need more protein. So if we think about a situation where you need to bring in more protein, maybe it's because you had a heavy workout training day, so you know you're going to have more muscle breakdown. A pregnant woman, she's now supporting a whole nother human being inside of her. Someone who is 10 years old, whose body is growing like crazy, they need more protein. They need to bring in more protein through diet, simply because their body's using more protein. So for moments in time, they might be in positive protein balance, hopefully, if they're doing what they should be. Positive protein balance is any time that your ingestion of protein exceeds your excretion. On the other hand, if you're sick or if you haven't eaten for a long time, you might be in negative protein balance or negative nitrogen balance, where your excretion of protein exceeds your intake. Over the long term, these could be dangerous if you stay in them too long. But over the course of days and weeks and months, we'd like to be in protein balance or protein equilibrium. Okay. I just stopped for a drink. Sorry about that. I'm going to take out this pen and see if we have... it's working. Perfect. Okay. This is part of the same picture that I showed before with the amino acid pool, but let's just move on. All right, here is the focus of a lot of part 2 here of this video, and that is protein intake, how the body uses protein as it relates to athletes and exercise, because that's what this course is all about. We're going to be referring to our same 3 sample athletes: powerlifter, team player, and endurance athlete. Here's an outline where we're going to talk about general observations, then we'll talk about endurance, and we'll talk about strength. Let's just jump right in. Okay. Now, I framed this conversation a particular way for a reason, okay? Because I wanted to show you how scientists think about things. So, as an everyday person, you might be thinking, oh, an athlete needs more protein. That's a very reasonable thing to say because we have a very logical explanation for why that might be true. Because athletes use their muscles more, they have more muscle breakdown, they're going to need more protein to rebuild those muscles. But when it comes to a claim like that, we have to do the research to really make sure. Okay? And when it comes to protein, this is something that, might surprise you a little bit in some respects. But I'm framing this in this way on purpose. We think athletes need more protein than a non-athlete. What does the research say? So our first thing to talk about is just to make sure that we have logical reasons why we think protein could help. So what are ways that more ingestion of protein could actually help an athlete? Well, if we think about the 2 ways that the body uses amino acids, maybe an athlete could burn more protein, so bringing in more amino acids could lead to more protein metabolism. Maybe. Or the second thing is that we might need those amino acids to join the amino acid pools, so when they go to the muscles, they can repair and rebuild muscles. So here are our 2 potential reasons why athletes would need more protein. Here's the evidence. Let's first address the first one. Do athletes burn a higher amount of protein than non-athletes? Well, the research shows that actually it does. What did we say? We said that 5 to 10% of all your energy comes from protein, which means that 85 to 90% of the energy to our muscles comes from carbs and fats. That's what we know so far. Well, the research actually tells us that athletes will actually burn a little bit more protein. Maybe a sedentary person has 7% of energy metabolism coming from protein. Maybe an athlete has 11% coming from protein. So it is true that athletes will metabolize a little bit more protein for energy. So therefore, we may need to bring in a little bit more protein through our food. But I want to point out that this difference is not significant. And that's why I picked the number 11, just to make a point. So we can see here's the normal range. Maybe an athlete is just a little above it. So it is true, athletes do burn more protein for energy, but it's not significant. So this alone would not be enough evidence to say athletes need to bring in more protein through diet. This is a little bit more specific information on that. You do not need to know this. It does get a little bit more into the weeds. So this is more weedsy stuff. Don't worry about it. It just is telling us that an endurance athlete is more likely to, it says 10, maybe 12%. Endurance is the more likely athlete to metabolize more protein, but that probably makes sense. But don't worry about knowing this, okay? All right, but what about our second idea? Our second reason why athletes may need to bring in more protein is it's needed to repair and replenish tissues, particularly muscles. Yes. The answer is yes. Especially, we actually tend to break down more muscle with high intensity activity. So it will increase our protein breakdown. We will need to increase our protein intake for about 48 hours if it's really high intensity, because we need to keep that protein turnover going. Because we've broken down so much muscle, it's going to take some time to bring new amino acids to the muscle. And what it shows here is moderate intensity to endurance. There's not a big difference in protein turnover. However, I think we could agree, and even though I don't have it on here, the research does show that there's, of course, more protein breakdown in these individuals compared to a sedentary person, but it's just not as much as a strength athlete. And this is going to bring us nicely into our discussion later when we talk about what kind of athlete is going to need to bring in protein the most, and that would be a strength athlete, simply because the high intensity nature of their activity breaks down muscle tissue more. Okay, great. So we're going to talk later. Athletes do need a little bit more protein, so we'll talk about that. That's been established. And the reason why athletes need to bring in more protein is because of the second reason, to repair and rebuild muscles. I want to talk about what happens with chronic exercise training. Take another drink here, trying to hydrate. One of my kitties, Mr. Big, he's a big boy, has just joined us. He wants to say hi. Okay. With chronic training, which means that if you train over time, you won't break down as much protein. And that actually is a good thing. So you might think, well, when I'm working out, I'm going to break down as much protein as possible. I'm going to break down my muscle tissues. I'm going to rip them to shreds because then I can rebuild them even faster. And that is not true. You want to tear down some of that muscle tissue, but you want to do it in a reasonable and appropriate way. If you tear down muscle tissue too much, then your body's not going to be able to keep up with replenishing it. So as we train more and more, we can put more and more pressure on our muscles and actually have less protein breakdown, which is a good thing. These two go hand in hand. So when we say we're more efficient, this means that it doesn't take as much protein to repair muscle as it used to. So we can spare some protein and have it for later. So more efficient use means that it doesn't take as much protein to rebuild muscles. And this is, of course, compared to a non-trained person or non-athlete. That's actually a good thing. You want your body to get more efficient. It just means that the protein turnover occurs faster. We're able to break down, get rid of the nitrogen, absorb proteins a little bit faster. And it's really like was true of anything else. When we talk about exercise, it really makes pretty much every process in your body more efficient. And in this case, it's it's another example, and it's a very good thing. It doesn't take as much muscle as it did when you first started working out, as much protein to repair the muscle. Therefore, we can spare more protein or keep more protein in the amino acid pools to be used when we need it. So these are all very good, positive adaptations to exercise training. Okay, so here's the finale slide to my whole spiel about, do athletes need more protein? The answer is yes. When it comes to a scientific argument, often you're going to find evidence that shows an affirmative to something, and you're going to find some evidence that proves not affirmative. Okay? So we did, in fact, find reasons to say, well, athletes don't really need to bring in as much protein. The body, even though athletes will burn a little bit more protein for energy, remember, it wasn't that significant. So this alone would not be enough to say, yes, athletes need more protein. And we just talked about the body uses protein more efficiently. So if you're well trained and you're more efficient with the protein that you have, well, maybe you don't need to bring in more protein. So there is some evidence to point to the no. But who's going to win this tug of war? This dude. Even though there's some evidence to point to no, this evidence outweighs the no. So the need for athletes to rebuild and repair muscle tissue outweighs the fact that, well, we don't need as much protein because we're more efficient with it and because we don't metabolize as much for energy. So overall, the answer is yes, because our need to rebuild and repair muscles outweighs the reasons why we may not need to bring in more protein. All right, so we're going to talk about the two ends of the spectrum, endurance versus strength, with the understanding that our team athletes, like the soccer or basketball, will fall somewhere in the middle. And that may be a little bit dissatisfying to you, but the team sports are very unique in their nature. So basketball is different than soccer, is different than football. And you might also need to look at a specific position. A soccer midfielder is more like an endurance athlete versus a soccer forward or striker, which is maybe a little bit more like a strength athlete because they're going to do small but very intense bursts, much more than a midfielder. Okay? So let's talk about endurance athletes and protein. We talked about sedentary people needing 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Remember? This is our number that you need to know for a sedentary person. But now let's talk about an endurance athlete. An endurance athlete does need more than a sedentary person. You can see a range here, 1.2 to 1.8. Again, there's so many factors. Depends on who you are. Depends on what type of endurance you're doing. I mean, 1,600 meter runner, which is basically a 5K, right? Am I getting that right? I'm not a track person, whatever. A 5K runner, that's still considered endurance in the terms of running, but a 5K runner has very different needs than a marathon runner. So we have a range to reflect that. 1.8 is pretty high. So I would say that would only be like our extreme endurance at a very high level. Personally, for most people, I would say maybe 1.2 to 1.6 is a reasonable range for an endurance athlete. Okay? And as a point that I'm going to say over and over again, this is something that can be gotten through the diet. Always preferable to get it through the diet than it is through a supplement. Let's talk about the need to ingest protein during activity. This would be the case only during extreme endurance. And this is the same thing we talked about with fat. Remember, anything lasting about 60 minutes or so plus, we should think about ingesting carbohydrates during. We talked about 70 grams per hour. carbohydrates. But only when we get to the 3 or 4 hours plus in continuous exercise do we need to think about bringing in fat and protein. You can see the reasons below. I'm an endurance athlete, so not only might some protein help with repairing muscles a little bit during, maybe a little bit more towards protein metabolism for energy, but I'll tell you something. When you're doing, an Ironman, it took me, 13 hours and 45 minutes. Eating only sugar, your stomach, you really can't handle it. So a little bit of protein tastes so good. I like to use Accelerate. I use this in the example in lab number 2. This is an example of an endurance drink. Has a 4-to-1 carbohydrate to protein ratio. When I'm doing the Ironman, I personally like these Ritz peanut butter sandwiches. Everyone is different, but with the Ritz peanut butter sandwiches, I get some carbohydrate from the cracker, some salt from the cracker, and that peanut butter, protein, and a little bit of fat. I mentioned the Accelerate. You can see the 4-to-1 ratio, okay? Now remember, when we talked about the fat chapter, we talked about those medium chain fatty acids. They had when they suggested the ratio of fatty acids to carbs, it was 5-to-1. Excuse me, wrong way. Should be carbs to fatty acids. So in both instances, we still bring in much more carbohydrate because it's so easy to metabolize for energy. So carbohydrates are still number one. But 4-to-1 ratio is a reasonable thing for an endurance protein thing during activity that's 3 or 4 plus hours. On the strength athletes, now remember, for our endurance athlete, we talked about maybe 1 to 2 to 1.6 grams per kilo of body weight of protein. Let's talk about our strength athletes. Let me just go ahead for 1 second. It's going to be a little higher. So here I might say 1.6 to 1.8. Let's use that. Okay? So to compare, our endurance athlete was 1.2 to 1.6. I want to make sure I'm really clear on this. So we had 0.8 for our sedentary person, 1.2 to 1.6 for our endurance athlete, and now we're saying 1.6 to 1.8 for our strength athlete. Okay? And these are just ranges, folks. Might Zydrunas, the world's strongest man in 2010, might he be a little higher than this? Yes. But for most people, they're not doing that crazy stuff. This is a reasonable range. The highest I would ever go is 2.0 grams per kilo of body weight. And the reason why is because, remember, our body makes protein for us, so we do not need as much through diet. Our body cannot store protein. So when you bring in excess, and it's more than you can store in the amino acid pools, and it's more than your body can get rid of through the urea cycle, we store it as fat. So I know we can say, I'm not a protein hater. Athletes most likely need more protein than non-athletes. These are reasonable ranges. But if you creep up to 2.0 or higher, they've done studies on this extensively. They've had people take 3 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight. And it does not have any positive benefit. It actually has negative benefits. That's a weird way of saying it. It actually has negative effects. Supplements. Listen, even to get these higher amounts, you can mostly get it through food, folks. Supplements are not the way to go unless you have a really hard time getting it through food, which with some effort, you should not have a hard time. I did skip this slide. For strength athletes, we would not be using extra protein to metabolize for energy, because if it's a strength athlete, shorter exercise duration, they're relying almost all on carbs. We would be using extra protein to repair, rebuild muscles, and potentially add muscle mass. Good. I've given you some example diets with using these numbers. So I picked kind of the middle. So I picked a sedentary, 0.8 grams per kilogram of protein. Endurance, I picked 1.4. Strength, I picked 1.6. So depending on your weight in pounds, and to convert your weight in pounds to your weight in kilograms, take your weight in pounds and divide by 2.2. And then take that number of kilograms times either 0.8 or 1.4 or 1.6. You don't have to know these numbers that I'm giving you exactly in terms of the weight in pounds, but I'm just giving you some examples of how you could figure it out for yourself. And then, let me give you some example diets. 106 grams of protein. That would be more than enough for this athlete, close to here, right? It's really not hard to get that amount of protein in your diet. I've given you some sample diets: a bowl of cereal, skim milk, turkey sandwich, a snack, and then a 5-ounce steak with potatoes with cheese. This is 106 grams of protein. And really, you probably have more than a 5-ounce steak. It's not that difficult. You want some more? Okay, how about 165 grams of protein? That would be enough for a 220-pound person who's a weightlifter. Sample diet here. It's not that hard. You just have to plan ahead. You have to think about it. And that's what this course is all about, giving you the tools to think about it. All right. I've already said this. I'm just making a point. What if we bring in more protein than we need? Can we store it in large amounts? No. Is it easy to get rid of? No. So if you bring in more than you can store, if you bring in more than your body can keep up with getting rid of, your body will store it as fat. I included this particular nutrition label because look at the amount of protein per scoop. 52 grams. If you would ever consider a protein supplement, look at the label. Now, to be fair, most of our supplements like this maybe are around 25 grams per scoop, but there's some out there that are absolutely extraordinary. 52 grams, I mean, that's more than some people need in a whole day. So you just have to be careful because you can bring in too much. And even though you think you're doing the right thing, athletes need more protein. If you're bringing in a lot more than you need, your body has no choice but to store it as fat. And that is not what your weightlifter probably is looking for. Okay, a couple notes here. There are certain sport-specific things to consider. There are athletes at risk for protein deficiency. And this is going to follow a trend in sports that are weight conscious. Let me look at these bottom two, like a weight-sensitive sport. You think about gymnasts and dancers. Dancing is a sport where part of the judging of them is based on how they look or their ability to perform a specific skill with grace, with quote-unquote grace, which involves how you look. These people will have to watch their diet. So when they're cutting calories, they may be cutting too much protein, which just like too much protein is bad, too little protein is bad too. You're not going to be able to rebuild the muscles that you're asking to do all the work. Wrestlers, depending on who you are and what weight class you're trying to certify at, you might be trying to cut weight. And if you have too little protein, it's going to affect your muscles. But there's also other athletes at risk. And I want to point this out because you may not be familiar with it. Amenorrhea is when a female loses her period. And I'm happy to share this. The first time I trained for the Ironman back in 2010, I was in my early 30s. I lost my period. About 3 months in, it just stopped coming. And this can happen in endurance athletes, particularly endurance runners, where there's a lot of training hours and the body type tends to be more lean. What's happening in that female's body is, without having enough protein and other nutrients, to be fair, without having enough nutrients, the body makes a decision to shut down the ovaries and the uterus. So it's showing you that your body's not getting enough of what it needs, and it's still continuing to try and feed your muscles, but it's taking away from somewhere else. And, in certain situations, this might happen, and you can be like, well, let's check out your diet, but it may not be the end of the world. But if you consistently train at a high level, and this is happening for months and months and months on end, it is a bad thing. Okay? All right. And also potentially vegetarian and vegan athletes. There's plenty of vegetarian and vegan professional athletes who do really well, even the endurance athletes. Do they need to take a little bit more time and effort to make sure they're getting enough protein? Sure. But it is absolutely possible. Okay, a couple other things to wrap up here before we get to the supplements. Okay, this we've already said. Just want to make sure we say it. When we are exercise training, your body will respond by increasing protein production. So when you train more, your cells are going to produce more protein for you. This is a good adaptation. Let's look at some other adaptations to exercise training. So when you have chronic exercise training, you're a trained athlete. Specifically with our strength athletes, you may see an increase in muscle size. That's called hypertrophy. Hyper means more. So when your muscle cells get bigger and you see an increase in muscle size, hypertrophy, it's a good thing. Endurance training, you will not see as much hypertrophy because endurance athletes don't want to have a lot of bulk on them because it will actually slow them down in terms of trying to carry themselves, either running or cycling, for example. But an endurance athlete will actually increase their density and number of mitochondria. It's a fantastic adaptation because mitochondria is where we create energy in the cells. I've already said this. Overall adaptations, we have better efficiency with protein. We better use the protein that we have. It doesn't take as much protein as it did before to rebuild the muscle. Okay, what about timing with athletes? Okay, protein is most important for athletes to ingest after activity. Now, 2 to 3 hours before an event, they should have some protein as part of their meal. 2 to 3 hours before the event, you should have a meal with carbohydrates, fat, and protein. What should you be ingesting right before activity? Carbs. What should you be ingesting mostly during activity? Carbs. What should you be ingesting immediately after activity? Carbs. So we're talking about a period after exercise, not immediately after. Now, some people, a half an hour after, might like a little protein. So it depends, but this is a decent range. And we mean not immediately after. Okay. Let's talk about amino acids as ergogenic aids. Last topic. How could bringing in more protein through a supplement help? Maybe it will reduce our protein breakdown. Maybe it will improve performance. Can it stimulate certain hormones like growth hormone? Can it improve our immune function? Listen, these companies come up with any potential reason that they think it could help because they want to sell you stuff. Let's tell you about the science. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples, and I'm going to tell you if you need to know this one or not. You do not need to know this one specifically. This is just information FYI. One potential supplement that involves an amino acid is a supplement called arginine. And arginine contains these amino acids: arginine, ornithine, and tryptophan. Does this work? Well, It can increase growth hormone release in really high doses given through an IV, but has not been shown through a pill to be effective. What I also want to point out is nowadays, now this was more popular 10, 15 years ago, but nowadays you can just go onto bodybuilding.com and you can buy some growth hormone just as it is. Again, you don't have to worry about this for the test. It's just information. And by the way, does growth hormone help your performance? The jury's still out. Some research studies show that it can improve recovery, but in terms of your actual performance, no. Another one that you don't have to know is orthanine. This was in this one, but because they want to make money, someone said, oh, I want to make my own supplement that just has orthanine. Maybe this can stimulate insulin release, which can be a good thing because then it can help us store more sugar and burn more fat, and maybe even promote growth hormone. No, research has not supported that. I'm not going to ask you this one either. Look at this. So many supplements. Aspartate. This is a supplement that's out there because maybe it helps you get rid of more ammonia. And see, the benefit is now that you know the basics of this science, you can make sense. Well, logically, if this actually did this, logically, that could be a good thing, right? Because we know the science, yes, if something could reduce ammonia accumulating, it could be good. But studies have shown this doesn't work. Even though logically that may work, that may help, aspartate has not been shown to reduce ammonia accumulating. All right, I would like you to know this one. And these are still pretty popular, branched chain amino acids. Depending on which one you look at, it's going to have a different combination of amino acids. Some of the claims are that it can stimulate protein synthesis, meaning your body can make more protein, decrease protein breakdown, aid in recovery, and reduce fatigue. There's conflicting research. Some people say bringing in this can help more, mostly for this reason. But I will tell you something else. These are easily found in food, and it is much cheaper. Instead of paying a lot more money for a supplement that has no regulation over it, remember that the FDA does not regulate the testing and manufacturing of these, so you don't know what's in it. It could be made in someone's basement or some crazy place in China. You don't know. Let me tell you what you can get. A chicken breast. This is more tightly regulated by the FDA. It's production, manufacturing, and sale of. And it is cheaper. And it has just as many amino acids. Okay, I'm off my little soapbox. Another one that you don't need to know is glutamate. I mentioned, in addition to the urea cycle, one way that we can get rid of nitrogen is through something called using it as glutamate. Research has not yet validated these claims. Surprise, surprise. Here's a table from your book. There's so many supplements that include amino acids. My suggestion is to get it through your food. Cheaper, more regulated, and for a lot of people, you don't need as much protein as you think because your body makes a lot of it for you. Okay. I do want to point out, if you bring in excessive protein, it can mess up your kidneys. And it can actually lead to dehydration. So if you're taking a protein supplement and you're at risk for bringing in more than your body can handle, the process of removing that nitrogen, because it taxes your kidneys, you're more likely to be dehydrated. And that can negatively impact performance. So you think you're doing the right thing, but you probably have enough protein through your food and through what your body makes. And then you could actually add on some negative consequences. All right, we're going to end there. Nice job, folks.